Production funding is provided by A. Reddix and Associates, Health Information Resource Center, offering short-term training for long-term professional careers in medical coding. HIRCVA.net.
Discussing the issues and celebrating the successes of the African American community. This is Another View.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. The White House recently released a study about American women. In it, the authors look at family, health, education, crime and safety, employment, and income, and how women fare in all of these areas. Tonight, our focus is on income and how in 2011, women still make only 75 cents for every dollar a man makes. And that made us wonder, where do African American women stand on the pay equity scale? Joining us for our discussion is Dr. Mona Danner, Professor of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Old Dominion University, and Althea Tate, Assistant Professor for the Women's Studies Department, also at ODU. Welcome to Another View, ladies. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
So now, we were at the Friends of Women's Studies dinner a couple of weeks ago, and a wonderful woman, Nancy Jones, came up to me and said, I've got an idea for a show. And was telling me that the AAUW, the American Association of University Women, have been working on this pay equity issue for quite a while now. Mona, let's start out with the definition. What exactly does pay equity mean in terms of men and women?
Pay equity refers to equal pay for work of equal value. In most of the statistics that we have, we're looking at actually all the statistics of the wages for full-time work, year-round workers. And what you do is you divide women's wages by men's wages, you get a percentage. And so, for instance, the 75% is 75 cents on the dollar that men make.
Okay. So now we're talking about if you have two professors side by side, same education, same degree, same tenure, then technically they should make the same amount? Is that what we mean?
Technically, they should. Now, the pay gap number that we all refer to actually refers to all workers. So we don't look specifically at comparing workers. When we do look at controlling for things like education and experience, what we find is much less of a gap. But in all cases and across nearly every occupation, women still make less than men do.
Now, is there, to break it down even further, then, as we're talking about African American women, is there a difference? Now, this is both of you. Is there a difference between how close, say, white women are to men, and say what black women are to white women, and then to men?
I think there is a difference, and the study did prove that was recently released. One, look at and Mona's just speaking of this, we're not breaking down the jobs by categories. So if we look at this, what categories are white women working in comparison to black women? So that's also going to be a factor as to whether or not a black woman is being paid less per dollar in contrast to black men, and white women.
And when we talk, Mona, also about the comparisons, we say men to women, that's all men compared to all women.
Right, for full-time year-round workers. Right,
yes.
So we take out the part-time workers and we take out people who are not working at all. So if you look at for all women, it's about 75%. If you look at African-American women, it's 63 cents on the dollar. For white women, it's about 76 cents on the dollar. Yes.
Now, both of you work in the Women's Studies Department. You've got young women that you're training now. What's their reaction to this? Why? I'm sure that they would think in 2011, I get my degree, I'm going to come out there and I'm going to make money just like everybody else.
Disillusionment. The reality hits. But I think that one of the things we do is to strive them to be aware and also to be proactive and seeking ways how they can change things. Particularly, they may look at a documentary. Let's take the 1969 strike in South Carolina, where you had 388 black women, 12 black men striking because they were literally being paid up to 70 cents less than their white counterparts with the same education. So when you show them that there's a reality, there's a struggle, but you don't have to sit back and be a passive consumer. There are ways, and this is what we're trying to get them to do, is to get in contact with their voice, to be politically aware, and then to be active for change, not just for themselves, but for everyone. because there's so much oppression taking place. When you see this quantitative data, immediately my mind, even though I'm not a trained sociologist, is like, what's actually going on here behind the scenes? What are other systemic factors that are at play? So when we see this, it's not just the quantitative data of just women are paid less. We've got to look at the intersections of class, the intersections of race, sexism that's there, the classism, that, you know, there's still structures of, okay, I live in this zip code, I should have this job, and you live in that zip code, you live in Park Place, so you should have that job. And those are some realities of educating the student. Here's your reality. Here are the tools to help you to counter them, to not be passive.
So you are a sociologist. Let's talk a little bit more about some of those societal structures that also keep women from making as much as men.
Well, oftentimes what we hear is that women choose occupations that pay less, and they choose this because they are concerned about being able to combine motherhood, family, and jobs. But it's fascinating because when we look at from the very beginning, right after college, women who choose to go into high demand fields that are well paid, they don't have family responsibilities, they're not anticipating them. So these are the women who are making the supposedly right choices economically. Those women within 1 year out of college in their first job are already making at least 5% less than their similarly situated male counterparts. So clearly something else is going on here. And frankly, what's going on is bias and discrimination, both conscious but more commonly probably unconscious. All the research shows that women and men just expect women to earn less, to want less.
You just brought up a really good point. So even women expect that they're going to make less in the workplace.
Yes.
Why is that? I don't expect to make less.
Well, they don't expect to make less than men, but when you ask them, well, what do you think this job is worth? Or what do you think you're worth? The numbers that they give are less than the numbers that men give. So we don't know if women expect that they're worth less or that men expect that they're worth more.
Absolutely.
So,
now, the Obama administration has been very proactive in terms of trying to bring more equity. The Lilly Ledbetter Act, that was the first act that President Obama signed into office. Explain a little bit, I'll start with you, Althea, about what that was and what that has done in terms of moving pay equity forward.
I think one of the things, and you can tell by the rebuttal he received, and people will say, well, wait, it's going to break down the system. What happens when all these retroactive cases come forward? That anxiety, I think, speaks more than, you know, him penning it and signing that into activity. And looking at that anxiety, what does it speak? That some people are expected to. You need to stay there, reparations or retroaction. That's not even an issue. We need to move forward and look at the ways in which we can be proactive in
But
that
for
sense.
those who aren't familiar with what the Fair Pay Act actually is, what does it mean?
Fair pay means that you have equal pay for equal work or similarly equal work, so very similar work, that there's no excuse for paying women less than men or for paying minorities less than majority persons.
And then beyond that, there was the Paycheck Fairness Act, which has not passed.
It has not passed, unfortunately. I believe it was in last November, the Congress, or December, the last Congress decided not to pass that. The Paycheck Fairness Act would have added more teeth to enforcement efforts. It would have actually trained, funded programs to train women and girls in negotiating skills. It would have provided additional support to women and girls to go into high demand fields like math, engineering, sciences, where their pay opportunities are better. It would have also allowed easier definition of a class for class action lawsuits. Yeah, so I want to say, Barbara, that one of the things that often happens is people say, oh, it's too expensive to pay, equitably, retroactively, or even right now. Minnesota, a number of years ago, passed pay equity legislation, and over a 4-year period, they raised the salaries of 30,000 state workers. It added to the state budget less than 1% per year for those 4 years. It's does not cost much at all to pay.
Sounds like a lot
equally.
of times change is the thing that makes people afraid more than anything else.
And it's that resistance that we're trying to speak to. There's a wonderful theory in Black feminist studies called intersectionality. And it's developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, and she pushes it out in '89. And one of the things that Crenshaw is saying, she uses particular cases. You take the Graff and Reed versus GM case. These were Black women who went because 1970, GM releases all of the Black female workers based on that they needed to take care of those who had more seniority. Now, one of the things that the court actually says is, you're not a particular group as Black woman. And that before '64, before the Civil Rights Act, right, Title VII, white women were hired. So when you start to hear these things, I think it's not a resistance of we don't want to pay tax dollars to go back and do the numbers to see how we can make things equal. I think it's inherently a political resistance, not wanting to acknowledge class differences, not wanting to acknowledge race differences, because immediately in that case, these Black women are compared to white women, who are usually in higher class, and they're compared to white men and Black men. And so you start to see different sets of groups of women really resisting a glass ceiling on different levels. It's not singular, it's multi-axis.
Now, and particularly in the African American community, but in all communities, women are more and more are the breadwinners. They are at the top of the class. With this latest recession, more men were laid off than women, and so forth. So how does that play into this whole issue?
Well, I find it humorous because I do, and I know I don't want to be cynical or crass, but I immediately think of Jacqueline Jones' book, Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow. And what she does is this genealogy of Black women in labor, looking at slaves and Mistress's Diaries, what Black female slaves were to do. You can think of Mother Mary Brewer, who is an Irish immigrant. And one of the things she did was to talk about how immigrants, you know, whether it was Irish or Old Czech at that point, coming to the United States, the labor issues they had to deal with. And so there are various groups that are marginalized, and there are various groups of women who've always been breadwinners for their family. And so that's why I find the irony of it. Well, what people group are you speaking to? It almost reminds me of the Bernice Johnson Reagan poem she pushed out in the late 70s. It says, my father had a turning place, mama. We had a turning place, mama. White folks had a turning place, all of us. There was no place for mama to turn to. She was it. And, you know, and you could, you know, not in trying to, you know, specialize on just Black and white issues, but I think that poem is universal for many marginalized women groups in the United States. So,
where are we going, Mona?
Oh, it's a very interesting question. One of the things that we know is one of the best sectors for women, in particularly African American women, is the public sector for jobs. In the public sector, the pay gap is less because those jobs are more likely to be unionized, have better benefits. But what we're seeing increasingly is a decrease in the public sector, and many of those public sector jobs are becoming privatized.
And not only that, but then you also have the fight like in Wisconsin, where the union has less power now.
Well, for more than 30 years, we've had an attack on government, an attack on the public sector, an attack on taxes. And that is hurting women dramatically. And it's hurting their families, and it's hurting their communities. The private sector is first concerned about profits. And so the best way to increase your profits is to decrease your labor costs. How do you do that? You do that through contingent work that doesn't carry many benefits and that carries lower pay. And that's a great concern. As we shrink the public sector, we're going to hurt women in particular because most of the people who occupy public sector jobs are women. So the women, individuals, their families, and their communities will be hurt. It's important to remember that salaries help pay taxes. They come back into the economy as women go out and buy the services. Absolutely.
So if a woman finds or thinks that she's being paid less, what recourse does she have? First of all, how do you find out? I know in the private industry in particular, there's this whole thing of we can't talk about what the salary is, and you never discuss your salary. So how do you even know in the first place? Either one of you, whoever wants to tackle that first.
Well, I know, Mona, specifically within the Women's Caucus at the university, every year there's a process through the EEOC office to make sure that salaries are equitable versus women versus men on campus. Yes. But I think we're obviously a state university. When you get into the private sphere where it's, you know, don't ask, that's private, it gets increasingly difficult. And I don't know, and that's one of the issues we're addressing. And Mona can speak to this. Usually one of the reasons why women are underpaid is because they don't ask for more. So where do they get the sort of fortitude to even say, something about this intuitively I feel is wrong? How can I actually begin to investigate? That's the whole other issue.
That's what's really important is that, first of all, you may not know exactly what your coworkers' salaries are, but there's always, you can always do research to find out what do people, what's the scale? What do people in this occupation generally make, or in this region, or in this rank? What are the general pay scales? And then compare yourself against that. But I think most importantly, if you, whether or not you're being paid, you think fair to your male colleagues, the question is, do you think you're being paid fair? Are you making enough money for the work that you're doing? And what's interesting to know is that when you ask that of yourself as a woman, you should increase whatever number you come up with at least 20%.
Wow, because that's how much less
that's
we think?
Probably how much less than we think that we're worth.
20%.
And why do we do this? We're all very well socialized to be good girls.
And good girls don't go in and ask for more money.
Good girls don't want to disturb the waters. And good girls assume that it's a fair world and we're being treated fairly.
Wow.
And even if it's not necessarily, I mean, I have many friends who have this issue that are not in my field of academia. And even if it's not, it's sort of this sort of socialized sphere of asking questions even, of wanting to be confrontational. We're thought, you know, everyone should be nurturing. Everyone should be peacekeepers. You know, no one likes someone who's just stirring up strife. But when it's actually a just thing to do, to ask questions, I think most women are just, I don't want to be confrontational.
Right. So they'd rather accept it.
My job is to keep peace.
And to keep the peace.
Well, and they don't even think that there's anything wrong oftentimes. They're just making the assumption that they're being treated fairly. Or if they think they're not, again, Althea is absolutely right. Well, I don't want to rock the boat, and they might fire me, or there might be retribution. And oftentimes what that really is women aren't used to asking. Research that's been done shows that men negotiate all the time. And oftentimes women think, well, you only negotiate when you're starting a job, or when you get more, when you get a raise, something, or when you want a raise. But we negotiate every single day. Will you take out the trash, or should I do it? Are you going to take the kids to school, or shall I? That's a negotiation, but women don't think of that as a negotiation. And we say, well, are you going to do it, or do you want me to, rather than saying, I want you to take the kids to school today. So that asking for what we want is a challenge for many women.
Different groups of women have that challenge even more so. I think, you know, I was just speaking to someone about latent trauma in certain communities. And by that I mean communities that have been traumatized by direct racial hatred, whether that's Japanese community during the internment camps in you know, World War II, or African Americans who are still in some ways dealing with the post-traumatic state, or the, Joy DeGruy-Leary, who's a sociologist, calls it the post-traumatic slave syndrome. And so some women feeling less valued to even go to that step of negotiating. Or you think about Latina women. You know, there was a recent study showing with Puerto Rican women specifically. We know in the 50s a lot of our birth control trials were in Puerto Rico before it's brought to mainstream America for middle-class white women. And so what happens when these sort of psychological scars are there, you know, preparing for this.
Because that adds to even more baggage in terms of what you need to do in order to make sure that you're equitable in the workplace. I hate to cut this conversation short because this is just fascinating, but we will have to continue. I know that there's going to be continuing work in this area, so we'll have to bring you back and talk about that moving forward. Before I let you go, though, the Women's Studies Department, anybody want to say something in like 10 seconds about what you want to do to promote that department over at ODU?
Yes, please come visit us. Our classes are expanding. My classes deal with intersectionality, race, and gender. I teach a course on beauty and performance. Dr. Fish, who is actually right now in Rwanda, returning in here shortly, is doing more and more coursework on globalism and the effect of the labor movement on domestic workers.
Fantastic.
And
We got to go. Thank you so much, ladies, for joining me.
And we'll be right back after this look at what's happening in Hampton Roads. There are two events I want to talk to you about coming up on March 26th that I'd like to tell you about. The first is the A. Riddick's and Associates third annual Women's Wellness Celebration, this year being held at the YWCA Southampton Roads. It's a chance for women to relax, rejuvenate, and reconnect, and I'm looking forward to serving as MC. And then that evening, I'll hopefully see you at the All-Together Cultural Tasting Dinner at the William and Mary School of Education. It's a celebration of music, dance, storytelling, and great food. That's at 6:30, and again, I will serve as MC. I'm looking forward to hanging out with you folks up there in Williamsburg. Next week, WHRO will air a special program on sea level rise, so we will see you in 2 weeks with sociologist and commentator Dr. Michael Eric Dyson. We'll see you next time for another View.
Funding is provided by A. Riddick's and Associates, Health Information Resource Center, offering short-term training for long-term professional careers in medical coding. HIRCVA.net.